Welcome to In the Strike Zone. I'm Jessica Salaji, your host, and in this episode, we're going to talk about the opioid crisis, who's to blame, and how we as Americans have allowed all the wrong people to claim they're the victim of this crisis. Much of the trend with regard to the opioid crisis in recent years has been twofold. One, demand the FDA do better, and two, find as many people as possible to blame and sue them. We're going to get into why neither of those things have actually helped the crisis in any way, but let's first do our due diligence and talk about the magnitude of this crisis. Because while most people know the problem exists, a number of them still don't see any true impact that goes beyond countable deaths. You know, the opioid crisis is a unique kind of crisis because it's something that everyone in America has a connection to somehow. It's not like meth or crack, where a lot of the population is shielded from the effects of it. Opioids are prevalent because of the pharmaceutical component of the problem. And whether it be because you know someone who's dealt with opioids or whether that person is you, the prevalence these days is too great for people to anymore say, I wouldn't know anything about that. It's something that affects all ages, socioeconomic statuses, educational backgrounds, and geographical locations. No one is immune. I know that the first time that I ever had a personal experience with someone who was dealing with an opioid problem, I wasn't even aware that it was a problem or that this person was dealing with an addiction. My college boyfriend, though, seemed to want to capitalize on a recent car accident that I had had, which yielded an ER visit and a number of opioid prescriptions for a shoulder injury. Having grown up in Alpharetta, which is in North Fulton County, I was rather sheltered and at the time naive. I didn't know that pill popping or sharing was even a thing. And especially because they made me feel so terrible, I couldn't comprehend why someone would want to take them voluntarily. And even though I declined his request, just like with any other addiction, these things don't just go away because someone tells you no. And this happened more than a decade ago now. And I know that the last time I ran into one of his family members, he was still dealing with the issues. And when I look back on it, now that I know the signs and the symptoms and how these things start, I have a totally different perspective. And I think I'd be more easily able to identify someone who was dealing with something like this. But the reality is that unless you've seen someone who's going through this, you can't possibly do that. And now, fast forward all the way through my 20s, I know dozens of people who have lost family members and friends to prescription opioids or heroin as a result of switching from prescription drugs, which were too expensive. And now we add fentanyl into the mix. It's just a mess. And the hometown that I referenced earlier, Alpharetta, and where I was sheltered and naive, it's now a mecca for opioids and heroin. It's part of the triangle in the state of Georgia where there's the most cases simply because kids and young adults start with a prescription drug cabinet and then they transition into something more strong. So it's everywhere. And it's affecting more people than most of us would probably like to admit. And it's something that I think a lot of people just ignore on a regular basis. But in reality, numbers from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which just came out in March of this year, which is reasonably fresh given how long a lag for health data usually is, they say that every day, more than 115 people in the United States die after overdosing on opioids. That's just deaths and doesn't even take into account the number of people who overdose but don't actually die. From a human perspective, whether you believe addiction is a disease or a choice, or however you feel about it, from a human perspective, this is so alarming. From a taxpayer perspective and from a libertarian perspective, which is how I look at these types of things, I look at this man-made problem and what it is costing us every single day. And the Center for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that the total economic burden of prescription opioid misuse alone in the United States is $78.5 billion a year, which includes healthcare costs, lost productivity, addiction treatment, and the criminal justice system and how it becomes involved. If you think about that and you break it down, that's $215 million a day that we're spending on this crisis. These numbers are staggering. And when you think about what $78 billion a year could get us, just think about the fact that the Department of Health and Human Services only needs $69.5 billion to operate every year. And the U.S. Department of Education only needs $71 billion to operate every year. But this is what we're spending to combat the opioid crisis, or to not even to combat it, but to deal with it. These aren't even, other than addiction treatment, this is mostly just the direct cost of what it's costing communities and people and taxpayers in services for these people. Now, when you think about the fact that it's $215 million a day, and then you put in a perfect world that all states are created equally, it would average about $4,300 a day in each state. But we know that that's not possible, and by sheer population alone, some states have been hit harder than others. But with the loss of productivity, the jails, the legal system, the medical costs, municipalities and states have partnered up for a witch hunt. Now, what do I mean by that? At the federal level, we saw elected officials and appointed officials push for reform when all of this came out. We've seen reforms for, how doctors prescribe pills. We established databases. We've banned certain types of gifts from doctors, from pharmaceutical companies. How reps can sell these drugs is different. How doctors prescribe them is different. How many you get at a time. How close between prescriptions you can get them. All of these things have been put into place. But none of that has seemingly appeased the public or any individuals, because individuals and government entities alike now want restitution, which is why we're seeing class action lawsuits from municipalities and counties. This started back in 2014. The first city to do it was Chicago, and a number have followed suit, and it's generally the same argument. Drug companies marketed and sold too many prescription drugs to too many patients. These states and cities or these counties and municipalities argue. They say that without offering adequate and accurate information about their risks, as a result, thousands of people have become dependent, often turning to harder versions of those originally prescribed opioids. Now, Chicago's seems to be what I would call maybe the most concise or direct allegation. They want to hold these pharmaceutical companies accountable, and they want the companies to stop using deceptive marketing practices. But listen to a few of these others that these cities are claiming in their lawsuits against these mega companies that generate billions of dollars every year. In Seattle's case, they have a city attorney, Pete Holmes, they targeted Purdue Pharma and Teva Pharmaceuticals. Now, Purdue is the maker of OxyContin, but they said that it's not just the companies aggressively peddled opioids to doctors. It's that they downplayed and in some cases failed to disclose entirely the dangerous and addictive nature of the drugs in question. At the same time, they overstated the drug's benefits. Fair, but it's a strong case to make, right? Well, here's another suit in Everett, Washington, far from Seattle. They have a population of only 100,000. They said that Purdue knew their pills were being trafficked illegally within the city, and they did not intervene or alert law enforcement. Now, this one really gets my goat, because private companies have no business trying to play cop or trying to intervene in a black market. And this is going to be the first mention of the black market. The next one is another example of the black market, but we'll talk about why it would be hard for a private company to intervene in something like this. The city of Indianapolis has sued pharmaceutical companies and claimed that instead of pain management, patients were administered addiction instead. And then they go on to say that the companies fulfilled prescriptions for unquestionably suspicious opioid orders, and that the drug companies failed to report them. So 2 cases for the black market, because Indianapolis is also saying that, they were unquestionably suspicious. Now, if by any means a doctor is doing something that is maybe out of line or illegal, then that would be in line with what the city of Everett is arguing, that the drug companies should have intervened and kept these off the streets in an illegal way. But there's something these companies or these cities are leaving out. Well, they're not asking how these drugs got on the black market in the first place. There has to be a middleman between the pharmaceutical company and the black market. So why isn't anyone targeting the third party that is possibly criminally responsible? Why are we going after this in a civil way? When I say civil way, I'm not even talking about individuals. We're talking about local government entities that are seeking civil damages. They're not looking for people to be held criminally responsible. They're not looking for, quote, dealers to get off the streets. They want civil damages to be awarded. Now, when I talk about Chicago being the first one and kind of spearheading this, and then some of the ones I've mentioned, you may be saying, well, that's a liberal city. Maybe it's because of their leadership, or it's because of their partisanship, or whoever was in power at the time. But that's really not the case, because this is something that's happening all over the country. cities, big and small, urban and rural, large and big, it doesn't matter where they are, north, south, east, west, cities across the country are suing. And Chicago started the trend, and a lot of people are saying, well, this happened with the tobacco companies, right? Is this not the same? But maybe it's worth acknowledging that the victims in the tobacco lawsuits were wrong as well. So why does it sound like I'm against municipalities and counties suing? It's because I am. Because local governments especially are not the victims here. If by the very definition of the economic impact of healthcare costs, which we talked about earlier, lost productivity, addiction treatment, law enforcement costs, local governments and cities are only possibly seeing an increase on the legal system side. Local governments don't fund hospitals, and if they are, they're in the wrong dang business, and they don't fund addiction treatment, and they don't have anything to do with the loss of productivity. So the only damage of economic impact that these local governments have to argue is the increase on their legal system. But arguably, they can't even show that this is true. If you look at booking reports in areas, in rural Georgia specifically, the number of people who are arrested on drug charges that have to do with prescription pills or heroin is tremendously smaller than those arrested for other drugs like meth and crack and even cocaine and even marijuana. So, it would be hard to tell for these local governments to go to court and say, our legal systems are just imploding because of all of these cases that we're having to deal with opioid addiction. On that same note, if these local governments really feel like they've been wronged because of this crisis, wouldn't the blame be directed at the states or even the federal government by way of the FDA for the lax regulation? We could argue that the states did not do enough to protect these local governments in these cities from these types of things because protections and regulations weren't put in place at the state level. They've retroactively done that. They've gone back and fixed state law. They've cracked down, developed registries and databases, and pharmacies are constantly in communication about who's filling opioids. We've gone and done those things. So if they're doing them now, couldn't these local governments sue the states for not protecting them? It seems wrong to me that local entities are suing a private enterprise for merely producing a product. You may not be a fan of the FDA, I'm certainly not, but if we have a regulatory agency that is responsible for, dare I say, regulating these things, and they didn't do that, it seems like they would be the guilty party, not the pharmaceutical company. So I refute the idea that these local governments have fallen victim to the opioid crisis, and would say that it's likely more along the lines of someone who was feeling rather litigious one day and decided that these governments as a whole should rise up against opioids. And I'm even more inclined to believe that now, since I found out that especially here in Georgia, attorneys were soliciting local governments to participate in the class action lawsuits instead of local governments seeking out lawyers because they felt like their community had suffered. For that reason, I'm hoping this all falls flat in court. So what about the states? Some of them have been successful. One of the first lawsuits ever brought forth was by West Virginia against Cardinal Health and AmerisourceBergen. And they both got $20 million and $16 million settlements. Others have sued Purdue Pharma, which I said is the private holder of OxyContin, and is arguably the most dangerous prescription opioid. Texas has said that Purdue violated the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act by aggressively selling its products when it knew their drugs were potentially dangerous and that its use has a high likelihood of leading to addiction. Now, the states are arguably more of a victim than the local government entities, but when they shift their argument, it kind of makes it hard to get on their side. For example, let's talk about Pam Bondi in Florida. This woman has been a bulldog for opioid lawsuits. She filed one similar to that in Texas and claims that the companies failed to report suspicious orders while knowing the customers were filling an inordinate number of prescriptions. And then more recently, she sued on behalf of Florida against Walgreens and CVS because she said that they added to the state and national opioid crisis by overselling painkillers and not taking precautions to stop illegal sales. Again, if the companies were operating, whether it be OxyContin, Purdue, Walgreens or CVS, if those companies were operating within the bounds of the law, they did nothing wrong. And I would tell Pam that she needs to look at her state legislature. Now, in Tennessee, Attorney General Herbert Slattery alleged that Purdue, again, maker of OxyContin, violated a 2000 settlement with his state and knew patients were dying from overdoses and that its drugs were illegally being sold to non-patients. Again, if we're talking about the black market, somehow they had to get on the black market, whether that was from crappy doctors who sold them to people or whether it was from the pharmaceutical companies selling directly to a drug dealer, which I'm not even sure is possible. But if that is what happened, those are criminal things. Why are we suing for damages in court for a civil matter when if it's happening on the black market, it's a criminal thing? Why are we focusing on cash restitution when we could be focusing on the doctors who wrongly gave prescriptions out to people who didn't need them, to pharmacists who may have put drugs in the hands of people without a prescription, or perhaps even a pharmaceutical company that gave directly to a drug dealer on the street? I mean, all of these things are far more probable and beneficial to the community and to the crisis overall than it would be to sue for restitution. Where's the money going to go? What's it going to help? Because most of these states don't have actual plans to fix the crisis in place. Here in Georgia, we put all of our clinics on hold and divided the state up into regions so that a certain number of addiction centers per region can be permitted under state law. Instead of helping as many people as possible, we're limiting, and the state is just regulating more and more. So the states have essentially shifted from the economic impact argument that the local governments are using and have instead gone to the "you should have known better, you should have stopped it" argument. But where the companies, again, legally, which in a court of law is the only respected threshold, responsible for halting the dispensary of pills to patients when they'd been prescribed to a doctor. Unless the pharmaceutical companies were handing these pills out on the street or to a third party who was handing them out on the streets, they were not legally responsible for what happened when the doctors or the dentist or the pharmacist who may have done something wrong, they're not responsible for what they did. Pharmaceutical companies, however, without a doubt, made this crisis a thing. I'm not giving them a pass on any of this. In the late 1990s, pharmaceutical companies reassured the medical community that patients would not become addicted to prescription opioid pain relievers. But listen to these statistics. Roughly 21 to 29% of patients prescribed opioids for chronic pain misuse them. Between 8 and 12% develop an opioid use disorder. 4 to 6% who misuse prescription opioids transition to heroin. But 80% of heroin users first used prescription opioids. I think that last statistic is among the most compelling to illustrate that either the pharmaceutical companies were terribly wrong about opioids not having addictive qualities, or they lied. But again, the question remains, who is the victim? If we're trying to offer restitution or reprieve for these people who now are addicted, or to the families of people who have lost their lives to people who are addicted, if that is the goal, if the goal is compensation to fix a problem, who is the victim? I don't think you could argue in any of these cases that the cities, the counties, or the state is the victim. Now, these pharmaceutical companies seem to continuously deny wrongdoing, like any good company will do, while saying that they want to help the states and the local governments address the impact of the crisis. Now, I talked briefly about how most states don't even have like an actual program in place, which is not necessarily their role. I mean, it is the role of the private sector and these nonprofits to step up and address a problem that the market needs. But when states are stopping or limiting these private entities from offering resources to people in need and who are victim of this crisis, it makes it a lot easier or a lot more difficult to actually implement change. So if the money is going to trickle down to the state, and the state is the one blocking these private entities and these nonprofits or making it harder for them to do business in the interest of these people who are affected, what good does that do? But regard to talking about Purdue Pharmaceuticals with regard to this lawsuit in Texas, the spokesperson for Purdue, Robert Josephson, and this is his quote, We are disappointed that after months of good faith negotiations working toward a meaningful resolution to help the state of Texas address the opioid crisis, the Attorney General has unilaterally decided to pursue a costly and protracted litigation process. We vigorously deny these allegations and look forward to the opportunity to present our defense. Okay, so inconsistency is my pet peeve, and this is where the private entity gets me. You either believe that you didn't do anything wrong, or you want to help cities, counties, and states recover from a crisis that was caused by a drug you made. It's hard to voluntarily do both and call it consistent, because it isn't. We know pharmaceutical companies are responsible from a standpoint of peddling drugs. I saw an article that was published in The Atlantic recently, and it wasn't 100% over the target, but it's closer than a lot of these other blame game articles that I've seen. And it's a great article if you have time to read it. It's called, "Did Free Pens Cause the Opioid Crisis?" Like I said, it's in The Atlantic, and it's by Ray Fisman and Michael Luca. But basically, the article is an expose on the pharmaceutical company Purdue and highlights how they rewarded doctors for prescribing brand name opioids. Here's a quote from the article. "Using information purchased from a data mining firm, the company determined which physicians were prescribing the most of its competitors' painkillers and dispatched sales reps to their practices. The more likely a doctor was to prescribe, the more often the reps darkened his door. The reps were highly motivated. Their bonuses were pegged to the milligrams of Oxycontin a doctor prescribed." Now, this is infuriating, and it's all something that we all knew was happening all along. But this is where, in the beginning, when I talked about the FDA actions not having a true effect on the crisis and the things that have cracked down, the FDA has tried to halt illegal websites peddling these opioids. The companies, they've limited gifts from pharmaceuticals. They've done all these things, put in all these rules and regulations. They've spent millions of dollars studying this crisis. They gather data. They do all these things to try to raise public awareness. But what they're forgetting is that unethical, immoral people will always find a way to be unethical and immoral. No matter how many rules, regulations, and laws you put into place, you add in unethical doctors who prefer financial gains over best practices, and morality will always be on the losing side. So after all this, you can probably surmise that I do blame the pharmaceutical companies. Not for producing the products, perhaps for not being honest about them, but not for the mere production. And not even for their incentive practices for their sales reps. I think it was a pretty crappy thing to do. But at the time, those activities were within the bounds of the law. And so we can't really blame them from a legal standpoint. Maybe from a turn your nose up, ethical and moral standpoint, wish they'd go out of business, hope lots of bad things happen to them. But none of those things cross the line of legally responsible. And you can't exactly put a company in prison. And people are calling for these people's heads criminally, but there's nothing that can be done criminally unless they were the ones who were putting it in the hands of people who were peddling these drugs illegally. And aside from making sure that we're advocating for the right victims here, which is not the local governments, we have to also distinguish between who is responsible and who is to blame. They're two different things. Is being deliberately deceptive a crime? That probably depends on the state, and Texas and other states are trying to figure that out. And I imagine soon we're going to see judges ruling on civil cases and ruling that these pharmaceutical companies had a moral obligation to be more upfront and honest, that it could have been, and it's going to result in judgments being awarded, much like the tobacco companies. To whom those judgments are awarded, I don't know. The problem is that at this point in 2019, the victims are the individuals who have lost their lives, figuratively and literally, and their families are the victims. And the guilty party is the overprescribing doctors who continue down the pathway of prescription even after all the negativity came to light, after all the public awareness, after all the threats of crackdowns from law enforcement agencies. It's the doctors and it's the pharmacists who wrongly gave out prescriptions without a prescription and put it in the hands of the wrong people for financial gain. But the victims and the guilty parties have shifted in the last 10 years. And as we've learned more protocols have been put into place. And sadly, as more people have lost their lives, not much has changed for these local governments advocating. While the number of people who fall victim to the opioid crisis grows, our state and local governments continue to play the victim card. And it isn't even on behalf of the citizens. Not when they seek restitution as a government, and not when they feel like they're the ones that are losing out. They're not the losers here. The people are. But they're not even advocating for them. And we've allowed that to happen. It's infuriating. It's infuriating to watch. There's so many bad actors in this, and the governments, these local governments, these state governments, they're only contributing to the problem. Now, I've been talking about these points for the entirety of this episode and still managed to only touch on a few factors of the opioid crisis. This is an ongoing issue with a seemingly bottomless pit of impacts from all different directions. None of these are more important than the other. They are all important. But we have got to hold our local and state governments accountable about who they're advocating for. Are they advocating for programs they say are going to exist but may not ever exist? Are they advocating for the victims? Are they advocating for the taxpayers? Who are they advocating for? Because they're not really making that clear. If there's any particular aspect of this crisis that you think should be brought to the forefront of discussion, feel free to reach out and let me know. But that's all for this episode, so make sure you're following on all the traditional social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and of course on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in to In the Strike Zone.